Hey, welcome everybody. Welcome everybody. Our next speaker is the president of the Mises Institute. He was the former chief of staff for Ron Paul, and I think most importantly, at a time when liberty has been more stressed than ever, these guys, Jeff and his whole group, have been some of the strongest, most unequivocal voices out there. So please give a warm welcome to Jeff Deist.
So a quick word about Jeremy Kaufman. A few years back when some of the social media deplatforming started, people said, hey, build your own platforms. And so Jeremy said, okay. And then not long after that, his parent company Library and his video platform Odyssey, the SEC came trotting along and said, hey, stop selling tokens. We're going to come regulate you. You're selling securities. And Jeremy Kaufman said, no thanks. I'm going to keep doing what we're doing. And then some lowlifes in Congress and some loud voices in the digerati came along and said, hey, you shouldn't have certain people on Odyssey. You ought to deplatform RT or some alt-right group or something like that. And Jeremy Kaufman said, no thanks. So to me, that's entrepreneurialism. And that's heroism, really. And he's done great work in helping my organization sync and have all of its videos on Odyssey as a backup. Now, we back them up internally as well. But nonetheless, that's been a huge service to us to have a platform like that. So we're very appreciative of that, and we thank him for that. So today, I want to talk a little bit about what Jeremy will speak about, I guess, this afternoon, which is the prospects for New Hampshire. And I think they're good. I'm actually very optimistic, probably more optimistic than I was 10 years ago, but for very different reasons. And so I think if you watch what's happening in Ukraine, there's actually some lessons there for New Hampshire and for the world. And if you notice, in the past couple weeks, since we pivoted from COVID to Ukraine, all of a sudden, nationhood is back in style. The Ukrainians are independent people. They have their own identity, separate and apart and distinct from Russia. What do you know? They even have their own language. They even have ethnic differences from Mother Russia. So, okay, great. Music to my ears. But you hear this and you say, okay, so what's a nation? What's nationhood? Who's allowed to have a nation? And what's the difference between nation and state? These are the sort of questions that come up that nobody really wants to answer. Is New Hampshire allowed to be a nation? Yes. Well, if you listen closely the last couple of years and you saw some of this beautiful sniping between the various governors of 50 states, you may have heard Gavin Newsom, California, refer to California as a nation state. And I thought, that's fantastic. And you may have heard Ron DeSantis down in Florida talking about Floridians, Florida man. And I thought that was just fantastic to get people in that mindset and to get people thinking about that, because I really think that the future, if we're going to have a better and brighter one, and this is not something I would have said even to myself 10 years ago, is far more about separation than persuasion. And I think that's just the reality we're in. So I think we start with the understanding that what we think of as the United States is really just an economic arrangement at this point. That's what the United States is. It's not a country. It's definitely not a nation. It's too far flung. It's too diverse. It's too big. 330 million people. So it's an economic arrangement. And if you want to be a little more dyspeptic about it, the writer Alana Mercer says America is Walmart with nukes. So when I say it's just an economic arrangement, that's a lot. Don't get me wrong. That's a lot. And that is keeping us together. And the reason America stayed together in its current form so long is because, well, at least up until recently or up until the crash of 2008 or up until COVID, America works. In other words, things work here. Energy and power work. The roads work. The banks work. The grocery stores are full. The travel system works. America works. You have hot and cold running water. You have electricity at your fingertips. America is an economic arrangement. So as that economic arrangement gets more and more shaky, I think our very concept of what America is going to change. It's, we have land and capital. We have Social Security and Medicare. We have cheap imports. We have an excellent distribution system. We have a strong U.S. dollar, at least relative to other currencies. So all these things work, but it's getting shaky. And when the underlying economic arrangement gets increasingly shaky, there's nothing beneath it to keep us together. America doesn't have commonalities. We don't have shared values. So we don't know how long, of course, the economic arrangement can last. We don't know what the inflection point or the tipping point is going to be. But we suspect it's coming. And if it fails, again, there's no real social or cultural arrangement underpinning it to keep us together as a nation. And I think if you watch the news, you'll see, for example, that the Fed Chair, Jerome Powell, he's been alluding to this shakiness a little bit. Just his press conference the other day, his hearing before the House Financial Services Committee, he made some allusions to, well, we're not using the word transitory anymore. And these new prices are here to stay, but we're going to slow down the rate at which prices go up in the future. So he's backed off of this transitory business, which was all designed to say, well, this is just because of COVID policies, as opposed to monetary policies. And then he made a pretty profound statement, and you got to understand, these Fed chairs speak in a very opaque manner. They don't let things slip, okay? They're very guarded in their language. He said, well, there could be more than one world's reserve currency. And that really sounds like he's softening us up. He's preparing us for a future where things aren't so cheap here in the United States and our dollar doesn't go as far. And we no longer just think, well, inflation's really low, because we've been telling ourselves that for the last 20 years or so. And if that's not true, or if it's increasingly apparent that that's not true, then I think all bets are off. So empires hate and fear losing control over their provinces. That's what empires do. But sometimes we forget that as imperial as D.C. has been over the rest of the world in what I would consider as disastrous foreign policy, it's been very much an empire here at home, too, in terms of imposing its over the 50 states. We don't think of D.C. as an imperial city with respect to us, but it certainly has been. And so when we discuss the prospects for New Hampshire, I think those dovetail with what we might call soft secession, and all that starts with pushback against this domestic empire. And so we have to stress that any political arrangement which denies people the right to walk away peacefully is by its essence, by its very definition, not liberal. So who are the liberals here? So what do we mean by soft secession versus the old-fashioned kind that conjures up the Civil War, hard secession? Well, it's something more than just de facto versus de jure, because everything in the United States, American laws and political norms, they've already become blurred over the past century. We just accept de facto violations of constitutional provisions. And so really, if we think about the U.S. government, the rule of law, the Constitution, the United States was overthrown long ago. We've already lived through at least one or two revolutions in this country since the original one. I mean, you could certainly call Woodrow Wilson and FDR revolutions. And the great journalist Garrett spoke about this. He said the revolution it took place within the form. We still have the Supreme Court. We still have the three branches of government, supposedly. We still have the president. We still have all these forms, but the substance of America has radically changed. So when we talk about breaking up America or some sort of soft secession, in essence, it's already happened and it's happening around us. It doesn't necessarily require this mindset that there's going to be tanks and planes and guns and we're going to break away in some sort of hard new countries and break up, and each one of those new countries is going to have its own legislature. So by soft secession, we really mean this counter-revolution within the form of what we already think of as the United States: aggressive federalism, localism, really an aggressive subsidiarity principle. And I think sometimes this takes the form of direct nullification or ignoring federal edicts, and sometimes it turns out that it's actually pretty hard to enforce these things locally. I mean, when the Biden administration came out with its COVID mandates, that's a pretty hard thing to enforce in North Dakota or Wyoming or someplace like that. So what we've seen is that COVID has given us a beautiful example of where things might be going across the 50 states. And even the urban versus rural divide probably intensified during the COVID period. So they're all beautiful examples of this. And I think the mindset of soft secession, it allows us to sidestep what we all have to admit are some pretty thorny issues involved in outright secession. I mean, we've got federal land, we've got federal entitlements, we've got a federal dollar, we have federally controlled nuclear weapons in missile silos across this country. Those are very tough things to deal with. So hard secession is a tougher sell conceptually with people. And also, of course, it conjures up in this country the Civil War and slavery and Reconstruction. And there's actually a Reconstruction-era Supreme Court case, which has an aside on a tangential issue, said, oh, and by the way, secession's illegal, which is obviously nonsense. But the possibility remains that a breakup could happen, because if you were in the former Soviet Union in 1985, talking about Ukraine in the news these past weeks, and you said, in about 5 more years, Ukraine's going to be independent, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia are going to break away, the former Soviet Union is going to become Russia, someone would have looked at you and said, you are absolutely crazy. And they would have said that in the USSR, they would have said that in the West, in D.C. as well. And frankly, they'd have been right. They'd have been right to say that, because we just never know what the inflection point is going to look like. So we hope that inflection point is going to be, in my opinion, soon and within our lifetimes. I don't want that on my kids or grandkids. But we also hope that it's going to look more like the former USSR and a little bit less like the former Yugoslavia, which broke up into 6 or 7 countries, but there was an awful lot of nastiness in the process, and much of it U.S. military subsidized, by the way. So this inflection point is all about being prepared for it and thinking about it prospectively. And that's what's so beautiful about what people in New Hampshire are doing, what the Free State Project is doing, because they're thinking about this. I would argue that the prospects for this are far higher than they've probably been at any point in U.S. history since perhaps the aforementioned Civil War. They're certainly higher than they were 5 or 6 years ago when this orange guy, Donald Trump, came down an escalator and said he was running for president. I would argue that these prospects are much higher than they were before COVID, before Biden started issuing these mandates. They're certainly higher than they were before masks and vaccines and lockdowns and all these other things that have divided the American public in pretty remarkable ways, I would say, over the last year and a half. So, we can go back to Bush versus Gore, brutally divisive election, a debacle in 2000 when the media started to use this blue state versus red state language. So this has been coming. And I would say, again, things are more divided now, even than we think of the turbulent 60s. With all the political violence in cities, riots, the political assassinations of RFK and JFK, and the roiling of civil rights and feminism, Roe v. Wade, birth control, radical social change across the country. But yet I still think America was more of a nation then than it is today. So COVID's given us the great gift of clarity, I think. Over the last 18 months, we've seen what we can call, I guess, the great sort, the great relocation. And it's proven to us that all crises are local. For the last 2 years, it mattered a hell of a lot whether you lived in New Hampshire or Florida or San Francisco or Seattle. It mattered a lot in terms of your actual day-to-day logistical freedom, how you go about, conduct your business, where you go eat, what you go do, whether you're allowed to go to church, etc. It mattered a hell of a lot whether you lived in Florida or Sweden versus, let's say, Australia or New Zealand. Okay, so these political differences, what we think of as just this soft, sort of amorphous Western neoliberalism, all of a sudden, even these Magna Carta countries like Australia and Canada were brutally locking people down. Okay, so there's no West anymore. Whatever our conception of the West is, it's over. That's over. And so the physical analog world made a beautiful comeback during COVID. It really asserted itself with a vengeance, because if you were locked down, if you were home, you had to be home. You're wherever you are physically. We tend to spend our days in this digital world on social media or thinking about these conceptual things. But wherever you were, that's where you were. You know, you had to have energy flowing into your physical analog location. You had to have calories coming in. You had to have medical care coming in. You had to have someone providing police or security services in your town. All of a sudden, locals started to matter, and people started to look around their own towns. And I think that mindset has been good for the Free State Project. The corporeal world, it's back. You know, you need last mile delivery no matter what's happening in the broader world. So it was really the time, now is the time that localism has reasserted itself. And so we know the federal government can't manage the dollar. We know it can't manage entitlements. We know it can't manage COVID. We know it can't manage Afghanistan, for God's sakes. It can't manage spending. It can't even run federal elections properly, much less provide security or justice or social cohesion. How's it going to manage a country this far-flung, this diverse, of 330 million people? So COVID gave us the great sort, the great reset, the great awakening, and it's profound. And it's profound in the sense that we might be on the cusp of reversing the dominant political trend, the overwhelming political trend of the 19th and 20th centuries, which was precisely the centralization of political power, whether that was in D.C. or in Brussels or at the UN. I mean, that really is the political story of the last 2 centuries. And what if the 21st century reverses that and turns it on its head? And what if it happens not because people like us have convinced other people to make some ideological shift, but what if it's just because of the sheer day-to-day inability of modern governments to manage their reality? They can't even fix potholes. So there's this centrifugal force at work in the United States, and we know that people are self-segregating geographically, ideologically. They're moving, which is just a wonderful sorting mechanism. And one thing about the United States is you can move across a vast territory without having to get a new passport, without having to learn a new language. You kind of have to learn a new culture. But I'm all for regionalism. I think regional differences in America should be celebrated and enhanced. I hate the fact that everything is the same. I live in Auburn, Alabama. I want the South to be the South. But there's a survey recently by United Van Lines, the moving people. So you don't need a think tank. Just listening to the moving company people. And they can tell us where their trucks are coming and going. And so you already know the story, right? They're leaving California and New Jersey and Illinois in droves. And they're overrunning Phoenix. They're overrunning Boise, Idaho. They're overrunning Austin. They're overrunning Miami. But people more in the know, people who think and see the world a little bit more like us are increasingly moving to New Hampshire as well. And I think we have to cheer this. We have to promote this. 10% of Americans, right? If 10% of Americans are just reasonable humans who hold reasonable views on politics and economics, that would be something like 33 million people, which would be larger than lots of European countries in and of itself. And so while we're having this voting with our feet, this great relocation, we're also seeing this really remarkable shift in political power away from cities towards exurbs and rural areas. And there's really nothing like it in American history. We started with colonies and small towns and villages, and then America expanded west towards open land and farmland and ranches. And then with the Industrial Revolution, of course, factories began to replace farms as the major source of employment. So people started moving to those big industrial cities, which we now call the Rust Belt, like Chicago and Pittsburgh and Detroit. And then the digital revolution comes along and people start moving to places like Silicon Valley and Seattle and Manhattan because they want to work on Wall Street or they want to work in tech because that's where the money and the jobs is. But we've had this revolution with work from home during COVID, and we've also seen a revolution in finance and tech, which means that we don't necessarily need to be on Wall Street. We don't necessarily need to be on Silicon Valley to do all these things. And so with COVID accelerating this trend of working from home and the decentralization not only of people physically and logistically, but of capital and of capability, this could have huge benefits for smaller cities and rural areas, which are less expensive. Young people starting out can go buy a house in some place like Manchester, New Hampshire, a lot easier than they can buy, a tiny, awful condo in D.C. or New York or San Francisco. And I think this is going to have really profound effects on the congressional map, on the Electoral College. I mean, if these school board meetings we've seen and some of the anger we've seen there are any indication, I think politics has already become radically more localized. And so COVID, or I should say COVID policies, a crazed overreaction to a virus, in my opinion, COVID policies sort of ruined big cities for a while. That's a hell of a thing to think about. And this is going to continue, I think, for a while. It's going to reduce the political and economic power of those big cities. So really, a once-in-a-generation, maybe a once-in-a-century opportunities before us. We should cheer this when Americans lose faith in the federal system, and whether that's due to Trump or Biden or COVID or Afghanistan. We know that public opinion show a really divided and really skeptical country. And so our political elites, our social elites, they miscalculated. They thought COVID and their disastrous reaction to it was going to increase their centralized power and their standing in society. I think it's done the opposite. I think it's decreased it. I think they overshot. And these teachers' unions, man, oh man, they thought that we needed them far more than they need us. And their reaction has been so bellicose and so belligerent to keeping schools closed and keeping schools masked. How many parents looked at that and said, if my kid's going to sit at home on Zoom, then why does my kid need the social studies teacher from the local town? Why can't my kid have the best social studies teacher on earth teaching via Zoom? That's a pretty good question. So I want to get to a question, an underlying question about this big sort, this new nationalism or micronationalism or localism or whatever we want to call it. Because I certainly believe nation and state are two different things. And I think Ukraine proves that. But the question is this trend towards breaking up, towards maybe what we might call new nations or new city-states or new polities, whatever it is all this necessarily illiberal? Because, gee whiz, Jeff, we're going to have more governments, we're going to have more bureaucracy. Is the potential for creating more states or even more aggressive political subdivisions within the United States, doesn't this have an illiberal bent to it? And I think the answer to this is no. I think the unqualified answer to this is no. Because again, the situation in which we find ourselves is far more about separation than persuasion. If you spend much time on social media, there is a vast, broad segment of this country which is, I think, pretty much beyond reach in terms of argumentation and rhetoric. And that's okay. Other people are allowed to see the world differently. We have to accept that and live with it. What they're not allowed to do is yoke us under a maniacal federal government that wants to run us and run the world. That's what's not okay. Of course, Mises had a lot to say about this. 100 years ago, in the interwars, he wrote two radically decentralist, pro-secessionist books during this period. So he's coming out of the sort of polyglot patchwork of 1800s Europe. So he was very concerned about the plight of ethnic and linguistic minorities in Europe. So, when you're a minority in a polity, whether that's due to language or ethnicity or simply smaller voting numbers, you have to be concerned about the political rights of that minority, and Mises was. And, people who care about liberty, we don't oftentimes think of ourselves as a minority ideologically, but I think that's the position we're in. So he really elevated what he called self-determination, the ability to walk away peacefully. He elevated this to a central tenet, a principle of real liberalism. And I think liberalism is a word that's played out today, but in the sense that he used it and meant it. And he condensed the whole program down to a word that he said if we had to condense it down, we'd call it property. Okay, that's a different kind of liberalism. So we tend to think of nationalism today in the West as a dirty word. Mises talked about the possibility of a liberal nationalism. What did he mean by that? Well, it requires a few things. It requires laissez-faire at home, within your borders, your domestic program. And it requires peaceful relations with your neighbors through trade, right? Because if you don't trade with your neighbors, you have this possibility of autarky, like the Germans who felt they had to expand so they could have more production or more food or more factories or whatever. So what we think of as a belligerent or bellicose nationalism is different from what we think of as a liberal nationalism. Patriotism is the love of one's own place or region. And Orwell tells us nationalism is the desire to impose that love on other people. So that's an important difference, and it's an important conceptual difference, which I think we ought to recognize. So who's against this? Well, our friends like Bill Kristol and George W. Bush are against this, right? Our friends like Mitt Romney are against this. They want one rule, top down for everybody. 535 odd members of Congress and the Senate, oftentimes not even them, oftentimes just 4 or 5 black-robed justices in what we might call a super legislature, known as the Supreme Court. When they're making decisions which radically impact the lives of 330 million people, you might think that that's not a recipe for social cohesion. And so here we are. Here we are in this radically centralized system, but the cracks are showing. And they're showing, I think, that this desire that the entire world has to live under your preferred political arrangement, which in the West today is basically agreed as some sort of soft social democracy, semi-capitalism. The insistence that every polity on earth has to be trending towards this, I think that's the real illiberalism. I think that's truly illiberal. And so there's a price to be paid. There's a price to be paid if you want to have the Free State Project or if you want to have New Hampshire have far more political independence and power, even if it is sort of a region within the United States or a state within the United States under some soft secession arrangement in the future. There's a price to be paid. And for most people, it's a very painful price. And the price is you have to give up on this mirage of universalism. You have to give it up because the idea that everybody else is going to see the world the same way you do, if you just beat them over the head enough times with 900-page books like Human Action, is a mirage. They're allowed to see things differently. Tens of millions of people in this country, perhaps a majority of people in this country, have what we could call a positive rights worldview, which is basically that liberty is a very, very different thing than the animal which we would identify. We would say liberty is basically when the state leaves you alone. They would say liberty is only when you have the means available to you for self-fulfillment. And that may require not having to worry about rent, not having to worry about groceries, having free education, having free housing, almost self-actualization as a liberal program. But the problem with that is self-actualization requires the participation of other people, at the very least through their taxes. And that's where we would define the left, I guess, to use a gross term, as illiberal. And it turns out that so many of the things we think are universal in theory, in practice are not. And in fact, it's our differences, right? It's what makes us different. It's the distinctions between us that create the division of labor. That creates the impetus for trade, whether that's between states in the United States or between nations. Maybe it's cheaper to build a BMW in South Carolina. Okay, fine. Build it in South Carolina. You don't have to build it in Chicago, but people in Chicago can buy it, right? We don't have to all have the same economic and political arrangements. So if we think about it, and Mises actually wrote about this in a variety of different places, universalism is actually inherently collectivist, and it doesn't comport with human nature. It's not how people actually do things. It's not how praxeology shows us the world. And so paraphrasing Mises, who decides what is universal? What state or what God is the final arbitrator of this? So if we say to ourselves, well, we start with this premise that you own your body and nobody can interfere with that and nobody can use violence against you, and you also need to have some material goods around you to sustain your life. We call that property, and nobody can aggress on that. And if they do, then you're allowed to use violence and force and self-defense or whatever. Okay, that's neatly conceptual for us, and it makes sense to us. But these concepts might be very, very radically different in Eastern philosophy. Even in biblical Christendom, there are a lot of people who object to this idea of self-ownership. You know, God's our creator, and the self-ownership sounds awfully, iffy. And so, yes, Mises was a utilitarian Democrat. And then Rothbard comes along and says, oh, no, I can make this normative case for laissez-faire, for statelessness, for allowing New Hampshire to be New Hampshire. But even though we agree to all these things, there's a lot of people on earth who would not accept our conception of property and self. And do we need to be at war with those people? Do we need to be at war with San Francisco? I don't think so. Even if we could properly explain it to each and every living soul. And this is a subject where someone like, for instance, Dr. Walter Block would disagree. He would disagree strenuously. He would say, Jeff, no. The non-aggression principle and all this is universal, and it needs to apply everywhere and anywhere at all times, across space, across history. It's just we keep messing it up. All right, well, maybe he's right. But would he object to 10,000 Liechtensteins replacing the EU? I don't think so. Would he accept New York and California having very different regimes in exchange for New Hampshire and Florida becoming largely unyoked from Washington, D.C.? I think Walter would, and I'll speak for him. Because he speaks for himself quite enough. So I'll close with this. This pushback we're experiencing across the West, I think it's directly proportional to the speed and the ferocity with which progressives have been able to impose and advance their agenda really over the last 100 years with Wilson, but even more so over, let's say, the last 5 years. And when I say progressives, I don't necessarily mean that in the left and right sense of the term. I think there are progressives on both sides of that, but I mean people who think that humans can be perfected and do a better job of living for the state and its larger purposes for us. To me, that's a progressive. And so when we look at what's been happening across the West, when we see these protests in New Zealand and Canada, the trucker convoy, and we see them in Australia, and we see them even somewhat in the United States, this is all reactionary. But reactionaries are reacting to something. They didn't just make it up. It's not all in their heads. Okay, so in my opinion, Trump had to happen. Brexit had to happen. Progressives had to be shaken out of their worldview, which is basically there's a deterministic arc to history. Everything's getting better and happier and more liberal. And Hillary Clinton is clearly the next president of the United States. I mean, it's just inevitable. How could anything be different? And so I think Trump and Brexit were sort of proto-secessionist events. It wasn't about Trump. It was that, 70-odd million people were that willing to go off the reservation and vote for him versus basically D.C. incorporated in the form of Hillary Clinton. And so I think these tremors that we felt, or maybe even earthquakes, Trump's an earthquake, Brexit is an earthquake, I suppose. Again, these are proto-secessionary events. And so progressives have been in a state of psychological coping and denial ever since, right? There's no way people could just disagree with us, right? That's impossible. So there has to be Russian interference. There has to be the Electoral College is screwed up and anti-democratic, whatever it might be. Or these are deplorable people who are so stupid and racist and ill-informed in their views. We're for democracy, but democracy is when the right guy wins. And we all know this. They lie constantly about this, but we all know this, and everyone senses this. So left progressives, they have opposed the decentralization of political power for a long time, and vociferously so, and for a very simple reason. They believe they're winning, right? If you think the whole arc of history is going your way, why would you want to let people walk away from that? We're winning. We're going to have Florida and Alabama and everywhere else. And so there's always going to be this tendency, and I know Free Staters have felt it, there's always going to be this tendency to portray any kind of breakup movements as nationalist or nativist or racist or xenophobic or whatever. They can't help themselves. Progressives can't help themselves. They have to view it this way because it's the only way that they can align it with their worldview. And I call it a savior complex. Alabama's horrible. It's the worst place on earth. The people who live there are Neanderthals, and we ought to jettison them from any form of participation in society. These unvaxxed Neanderthals. Okay, well, let's break up. Whoa. Can't do that. And you know why? Because there are women in Alabama who would then be denied abortions by these retrograde policies. Or there are black folks in Alabama who would be living under this racist thumb of some theocratic government. I mean, that's always the explanation for the progressive saviors. And so they had to be shaken up. They had to suffer some losses. Their sense of inevitability had to be challenged. And I think Trump and Brexit did that. So regardless of the ideological component, I think we have to understand how important those events were because it made progressives of all stripes, from Bill Kristol to John McCain to AOC, it made them question their own doctrine of inevitability. So soft secession actually offers the left a chance to have far more of what they want right here, right now. The whole panoply of progressive programs, you could have that right here and now, and there's no problem with that. And they should take the bargain because the deplorables are more numerous than they thought, and they're hanging around longer than they thought. And so right here, right now, the state of California, 40 million people, could be an absolutely fine nation. It has ports and access to eastern markets. It has beautiful weather, mountains, beaches, deserts. It has industry, Silicon Valley. It has wonderful universities. It has Disney. It has Hollywood. It has Palm Springs. Now, there's no reason that's not a nation, folks. And there's no reason they can't have everything they want right here and now. Universal health care, steeply progressive income taxes, gun bans, abortion on demand in the last trimester. There's no reason they couldn't have all these things right here and right now, and there's no reason that anyone should object to that. I certainly don't. But the price you got to pay for that is that they have to let New Hampshire be New Hampshire. And the question becomes, is that a price that we are all willing to pay? So God bless you for doing what you're doing. Thanks.
Thank you very much. You know the drill. Come up here if you have a question. Say your name. Keep it brief.
Welcome, Jeff. Dennis Pratt. I really like everything that you're doing, and you've talked about this great separation, and we talk about all these libertarians who are in that bottom 5%, 10% of the states that are just feeling so besieged. They're surrounded by people who don't like them and who don't want them, and then we have the Free State, where there's all these thousands of people who really support them. I mean, that's also true of some institutions. I mean, imagine an institution that was in a state that was really kind of authoritarian. And then they are so supported by this other state that is very free and very pro-Miesian. Wouldn't it make sense to have at least a satellite in that state? Some way of having a real connection between that state and this bastion of freedom.
Well, I think states are connected. I mean, look at all the people around not only Eastern Europe but also even in the U.S. who are connected to Ukraine because they have relatives or something and they're concerned about it. I mean, that's the connection right there. It's trade, travel, openness. And there could be a political connection between satellites in the sense that it might make sense for let's say a United States that was broken up into regions, if not states, if not localities, to maintain some sort of defensive arrangement. Jesus Christ, we got enough tanks and guns and bombs and planes to divvy it up. But I mean, the former EU or NATO is a form of an alliance. It's not my favorite, but it's the form of an alliance that where satellites have some connection to one another, some shared commonality for defense, or trade zones like the EU. I think that's fine, and I think that's realistic. This isn't about ANCAP tomorrow. This is about better.
Well, really, what I'm asking for is a Mises chapter in the Free State.
Well, this is it.
Hi, my name is Tim Brochu. Whenever you have a secession, you end up with some remnant of the former political majority or cultural majority that finds himself now a political minority in the newly formed state, like the ethnic Russians in the Donbass region in Ukraine. So I guess I'm asking, if and when New Hampshire secedes, what do we do with the people from Massachusetts?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question. People are hurt in these things when you redraw these lines. I mean, people are hurt. If my aforementioned scenario with California happened, there's a bunch of real right wingers in California. Trump got more votes in California than any other state just because of its size. So there would be a bunch of people in California who really felt, oh my gosh, I'm on an island here. I'm all alone. But I think what you need to do is allow people to move away, to allow people to self-segregate. And you say, well, I don't want to do that. Oh, okay. I get it. You don't want to do that. There's some hardship in that. You have to leave family. You have to leave it. Okay, but it's like, look at some of the hardships people have endured in the past centuries to obtain more political freedom. I mean, we're pretty soft. So, you call that the rump state. I mean, at some point you have to say it's, at the local level, I guess I am a little bit of a Democrat. That, if you don't like it, you got to go back to Massachusetts. I mean, on some hyper-local level, I know that sounds bad, but what are you going to do? I mean, you're not asking them to go across an ocean or to, speak another language.
On that note, and maybe Jeremy can explain more, but I think we do have a program for actually helping people, and I'm happy to donate to that.
Jeremy is underwriting that personally.
Yeah, well.
Tell them we'll pay. If anyone complains about New Hampshire, we will pay. We're trying to find someone to take this. We're going to pay the whole way. We're going to fly him in a helicopter.
But if you notice, I think there's an important point here to make. When you notice even the rhetoric of Sununu, I know he's met with some Free State people, and he hasn't been completely hostile. But if you look at there's a lot of anti-Free State project rhetoric, let's say on Twitter, to public school teachers, et cetera. And that's not a good sign. Because if you look at some of the excesses of, let's say, Black Lives Matter or Antifa violence over the last couple of years, a lot of folks on the left would say, that's wrong, that's bad, I don't agree with that, but they have good intentions, they're good-hearted, the underlying cause is just. Right? So they'd kind of be like, well, we should minimize that because, gee whiz, yes, they burned down a police station, but... So whereas with the Free State Project, it's immediately assumed that your objectives are somehow sinister or not, valid. And I think that's the mindset you're fighting.
Appreciate everything you guys do there at the Mises Project. My name is Paul McNeil. My question was just about recent efforts. If you're familiar with recent efforts to ratify the original First Amendment that limited representation to 50,000 people, if you're familiar with that at all and have any thoughts about that. I think there's the tactical civics sort of that's part of, but just that effort at all.
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, the first U.S. Congress was, I think, had 62 U.S. reps for about 4 million people. And so you do the math on that, and it comes out today we should have 10 or 15,000 U.S. House members. So New Hampshire's, I believe, first in that in terms of the representation. And so that makes living in New Hampshire more like, dealing with your city council or something. You should know, unless you're in a really rural place, you should basically know who your U.S. representative is and be able to run into him or her at the grocery store or something. And they should kind of fear you a little bit, right? Like I live a couple blocks away from the woman who represents my portion of the city council. town of about 80,000 people, college town, easy. She feels it a little bit when people are pissed about something super local like a road construction project that's taking too long. And I think that's a healthy thing. When these people are far away and there's only one U.S. rep for every about 750,000 people, that's bad.
Yeah. Thanks. Dan McGuire. I think you're right about the political world being more ripe for separation, but it seems like the economy is the other way. The destruction of small businesses, the dominance of Amazon, Google, Walmart, et cetera. So does that make us maybe ripe for fascism, or I mean, is that a problem against your thesis?
I think it's a huge problem, and it's not an easy one. I mean, in many senses, Amazon's the greatest thing ever. I mean, you go on, and 2 days later, just at your door, this is insane. But the dirty little secret is Amazon doesn't really make money. The only part, delivery doesn't make money for Amazon. It loses money. Their web services, in which they're a large federal contractor. That's where Amazon makes their money, is hosting clouds for the Pentagon and DOD. Okay, not getting toilet paper to you in 24 hours. And so for a public company to be traded for that many decades and not make an operating profit until recently, that tells you that it's all about simply buying the stock and selling it for more to someone else. You're not getting dividends. The company's not making money. That strikes me as a bizarre symptom of Fed-fueled crony capitalism. That's a Ponzi scheme of sorts, where it's just buy low and sell it to a greater fool. I think, look, 10 years ago, I would have said, I think I was wrong in many ways about big corporations. I would have said, some pissed off traffic cop or some DMV employee who's in a bad mood, they have more power over you than Google. Because, you have to go get your license. You have to drive down the road. But Google, you don't have to use Google. You don't have to use Gmail. You don't have to use their search. That's voluntary. I think I've been forced to change my thinking about that a lot, in part because of what I learned from Michael Rechtenwald about how unbelievably state-connected Google's origins are. Oh, my gosh. And that applies to some of these other companies. So, I don't know how to go at that other than to try to strike away at the state side of the state corporate equation.
Hi, so my name is Zephin. I'm sort of bullish on New Hampshire becoming a libertarian homeland in my lifetime, and so my question is, what sort of practical steps do you think we could take to actually make that a reality sooner rather than later?
I would say that the most important thing is to be working on some kind of payment system for when the U.S. dollar gets really, really shaky. I don't know if Sununu's got that in his conceptual wheelhouse. I hope that's Bitcoin. But if it's not, or if Bitcoin just isn't ready, even with payment layers, whether that's a gold or silver repository, something that could make New Hampshire have a better outcome when the federal dollar really starts unraveling. And yes, you're getting your Social Security check for $2,000 a month, but $2,000 a month is your cell phone bill. I think more than anything else, trying to be financially independent by having an alternative to the dollar would be the single one thing I would recommend to any area, any state, anything else trying to be independent. So thanks, guys. Thanks, Jeremy.